Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Tuesday, November 14th, 2023. Tonight's topic is social anxiety. And before I begin, I just want to tell you, I spent some time today perusing popular podcast episodes about social anxiety and about anxiety, just to hear what others who are teaching about this topic are saying about it. And I had a ton of compassion for the consumer in this field, this area, because all of the stuff that I stumbled onto, and I probably listened to 8 or 9 different podcasts today, not the entire podcast, but large portions, large chunks of them. And the things that they were saying were so simple, so basic, so inaccessible in some ways. And so tonight, as always, I want to dig down and at the deepest level and understand the human psyche, human behavior, what's happening, and really the method to heal social anxiety, to really get at the heart of the wound and the trauma that social anxiety is a manifestation of. Before I get into that, and in line with that, I'm going to announce this at the beginning. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and about how obvious it is to me today that the future is these kinds of therapeutic intensives that we run at Evoke. Finding You is our version of it. And as I always share in all of my other broadcasts, if you have any skepticism about Evoke and our approach, go to somebody else's. But the primary feature of this is going back and looking at delving into your childhood and sitting in a room full of 6 other people in our case, because we do it in groups of 7, sitting in the room with 6 other people who are also going back to discover their childhood, how they were built, how they were programmed and taught, the messages that they've internalized, and how that's showing up today in their challenges. I can think of nothing more valuable therapeutically than to attend one of these. If somebody were to say to me, I have a limited amount of funds to help my child, what would you recommend? My response would be, first of all, go to Al Anon and Codependence Anonymous, because those are free. That would be my first response. But my second response would be a therapeutic intensive like Finding You. Our next offering is December 6th to 10th. I know that falls in between two major holidays. And for a lot of people, that's kind of a lost time of their life. But I also can't think of a better time to be doing therapeutic intensives. And like I've said, every time I talk about this, I myself have done, I think the last count was 9 of them myself as a participant at somebody else's program. That's how much I believe in it. And I've sent my adult children. My wife has been to a couple. My partners, my business partners have gone to those go versions of these. We've had employees that we've supported. I've supported and scholarshiped many friends and extended family. I really believe in this product. Finding You in-person intensive. We also have an online version of it. You can check the website for more information there to find out about our online versions also. And we have custom and couples and families intensives also. But I just wanted to say that it's so clear to me that this kind of work is the foundation of anything else you can do for your family, for your child, for your marriage. So let's get into social anxiety for the evening. I'm going to read to you a summary of the diagnostic criteria listed in the diagnostic manual. First of all, there's a marked fear regarding social situations where the individual is is sensitive to the scrutiny, exposed to the scrutiny of others. So it's some situation where you're exposed to scrutiny and there's a chance of criticism. These social situations almost always cause anxiety. School can be it, work can be it. It's funny. I thought one of the criteria was funny about this because it said it's not limited to public speaking, because of course the universal experience with public speaking is that it's so challenging in terms of our anxiety that if they included that in the criteria for social anxiety, everybody would have it. But the social situations almost always provide anxiety, and it's out of proportion to the actual threat. That's the thing that's most profound about social anxiety and anxiety disorders in general, is that our brain tells us that the threat is real, that the threat is life or death, that the stakes are fantastic and great. Even though that part of our development, our DNA, our organicity, our background, our history, our evolution, even though that trigger, that fight or flight response was meant to protect us from real threats in modern life, because many of us, glad to say, happy to say, aren't posed or presented with everyday threats to our physical safety, our death, our life on a daily basis. Of course, some people are, but most of us aren't. But we still have that same mechanism that says that the stakes are fantastic and great. So, the very first intervention, if you will, of tonight's broadcast is to normalize the experience as being somewhat universal, that we all have this experience, that if we get rejected or criticized, or if the people around us don't accept us, don't love us, that we will die, that we will, it feels like to our body that we won't survive. That belonging to a group and being a part of something is anxiety reducing. That's for positive and not so positive reasons, right? The belonging drive for the Homo sapien, for the human being, is so great that we'll join gangs, right? We'll join groups that themselves pose a great threat to us, because the need to belong to something larger than ourselves is so profoundly wired into our species. Like I always say, in and of ourselves, as individual human beings, we are somewhat pathetic when compared to other creatures on the planet. But as a species, we are clearly the most dominant creature on this planet. And the ingredient that makes it so is our ability to connect, to bond, to communicate, to share information, right? Everything on my desk, everything on my computer is the result of thousands, maybe even millions of individuals' contributions. And I rely on that for my daily activity, as do you. But it's deemed that the actual threat is not as significant as our brain tells us that it is. Situations are either avoided or they are endured with intense fear. People are miserable, or they just don't do it. They avoid going outside. They avoid going into social situations, going to dinner parties. School refusal is a huge piece that so many of our parents are grappling with their children, because children are experiencing so much anxiety. The anxiety impairs social or occupational or other important areas of functioning. So it's not just that we don't feel good, but it limits our ability to behave and perform in social relationships or in tasks related to our job, academics, what have you. That it's that overwhelming that it impairs us. And we know that fear reduces creativity, because creativity requires risk. It requires getting it wrong. I've told the story many times of my son, who was at art school at the Chicago Institute of Art. And when he was playing around with a painting and his professor noticed that he was being hesitant, she asked him, "What are you doing with this painting?" And he said, "Well, I just don't want to ruin it. I'm afraid I'm going to ruin it." And she said, "Now your assignment is to ruin the painting, to paint it enough that you're going to ruin the painting." And what she knew as an artist and as a teacher of art is that you have to be willing to fail. You have to get good at failing, good at messing up. So you're starting to hear some of the programming that we have, that we pass on to our children, that failure is to be avoided, that failure is a bad thing. Sigmund Freud felt so strongly in the opposite direction that he said, if you really want someone to grow, you have to put them into a situation, a context where they are sure to fail at it. It's hard to grow emotionally. It's hard to experience expansion without failure. It lasts for 6 months or longer. That's the diagnostic code, that this pattern of anxiety lasts for 6 months or longer. Anybody can experience state anxiety in a given moment, but this is a trait anxiety that becomes stable over time. And then, of course, it's not related to substance use or another medical condition or diagnoses. So that's what social anxiety is. That's what the diagnostic manual says that it is. So let's talk about what it is beneath the surface. What causes it? What are our children, and us for that matter, And rarely do I see one without the other. Rarely do I see a significantly anxious child without a parent who struggles with anxiety. It is contagious. It is something that is in the air, that is breathed by the family members, the water that they drink together. And so much of the work, this is really important for me to explain. So much of the work for parents is to understand and own and come to terms with your anxiety, potentially even your anxiety that rises to the level where it gets classified as an anxiety disorder. If you don't do that, if you don't see that you're anxious, you will bleed onto your children. You will spill it onto your children. You will leak all over them and they will absorb it. The number one, maybe this is too extreme, but I'm going to say it anyway for the purposes of tonight. Perhaps the most important and primary responsibility of a parent or a partner in a relationship is to take responsibility for the regulation of their own nervous system. And that is, I say that in the context of the fact that there are difficult and scary things that happen in the world, both personally and in our communities and of course around the globe. I think one of the things that happened during the pandemic for a lot of people is that we became such inside people for the most part, and we became even more connected through our phones to what was going on in the world. And there was so much fear and anxiety about the pandemic that we wonder why children came out of it anxious. It's because we exhibited anxiety. I had extraordinary anxiety being somebody who's immunocompromised. I had severe anxiety about getting it. My father died in the first month of COVID with COVID. So I had the same genetics as somebody that I knew that died right out of the gate, and I'm immunocompromised. And so I was constantly anxious and watching the news and listening to the reports and listening to the conflict that was out there. It was early on in COVID when one of my children said, please turn the news off when I'm in the room. And that really hit me. Not just that they made that request, but what hit me was the impact of my anxiety, of what I was consuming, and how it was affecting my children. We believe that the nervous system of a Homo sapien, of a human being, was not meant to take on all the world's tragedies and injustices in real time, all the time, 24/7. We were built as creatures to take on the tragedies and injustices of our small tribe, 30 to 60 people. But now, because of social media and the news cycle, we have access to it constantly. People think that they're going to their social media even to escape. And we could talk about that and criticize that if we wanted to. But even if you're going to escape, what leaks through on our social media are all of the injustices and tragedies and traumas that are going on around the world. I've been working on this myself for the past couple of years, really cleansing my phone and my algorithms of the news in the world. And I know that might be shocking and go against so many people's ideas of what a good citizen does and is. But I realized that I can't consume trauma. I can't get done after 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 hours a day of working with people and their trauma, listening to people's personal stories of abuse and neglect and pain. I can't leave that context, go into my living room where there's a TV or I have access to a computer or my social media feed on my phone, and I can't consume trauma. And I don't debate this with anybody. I don't say this is the right way to live. I just know that I can't, that it's not good for our nervous system. What does it do? It makes me a less informed citizen for sure. Right? I only get glimpses and headlines that kind of get fed through me to me through my clients and through my family members and through the social media that I do look at that hasn't been completely erased, but I can't do it. And so part of what I want to suggest at the beginning, maybe my second intervention of the night, is it's critical that we are conscious about our consumption of trauma. And again, I can't talk you out of it or make the case that proves to you that it's the right thing to do. But if you're consuming trauma, wars, deaths, fires, murders, injustices, if you're consuming that at a high rate, the chances of being regulated, having a regulated nervous system, are pretty slim. It's going to be pretty difficult. You can't separate yourself from that information. The first thing I want to say about looking at trauma is medication can help. If it rises to the level where the things that we know to do, like having good sleep hygiene, eating well, exercising, getting outdoors. That's a big part of our program. In fact, I always find that when I'm describing what are the ingredients, the natural ingredients in anti-anxiety and anti-depression lifestyles, I'm describing wilderness therapy in a very clear way. However, if we can't even go to therapy, go to meetings, read a self-help book, do the things that would help us to feel better, to alleviate that anxiety or that depression, medication can get you in the starting gate. Medication won't necessarily solve all of it. It's not the complete answer, but it gets you to a baseline where you're able to access, to make use of the other tools, the other activities that I just described that we know are an important part of a regulated nervous system. Fundamental to social anxiety is this idea of perfectionism. This idea that we have to be good instead of being a person. Two of the movies that I've been obsessed with over the last couple of months, talking about on these broadcasts, talking about even in my personal circle, Everything Everywhere All at Once, and the Barbie movie. I've been obsessed with those over the past several months. Teach this principle that we have to learn to be human. We have to figure out how to get rid of the ideas that we were taught that the goal in life is to be a good person, to be perfect, to not make mistakes. And that if we do make mistakes, if we do fail, that all is lost, that it's a tremendous tragedy. That idea is in our brains. It gets registered in our brains as guilt. That's why I am so passionate in talking about and teaching about the harmful effects of guilt in our lives. Not just shame, that I think most people are fairly clear on, but guilt is a damaging, eroding power on our psyche, our stability, our resilience. We have to figure out how to learn to be who we are, to be a person. The very idea that we should be good causes substance abuse disorders. Is at the root of it? Is at the root of anxiety, like I'm talking about tonight, depression? The reason that people like alcohol and heroin so much is because it immediately makes the individual who's taking it feel like it's going to be okay. They call alcohol liquid courage, right? Courage being the opposite of anxiety in many ways. When I talk to children in our wilderness program, I'm constantly saying, I understand why you're doing this. You have no other ways and no other models for how to manage your anxiety. And it works, and you're seeking for this feeling that almost feels like when you drink for the first time, when you're predisposed to this way of coping, it feels like home. It feels like it was meant to be. It feels like the way that you should feel. Maybe even the way that you imagine that other people feel. That's why it's so attractive. Now, it doesn't work in the long run. The next morning, you're every bit as anxious, maybe even more so because of the withdrawal that happens even from a heavy drinking night. But I understand the attraction. It's the search for. It's kind of a spiritual bypass. It's chemically giving yourself the feeling, the sense of what it would feel like if you were living a more balanced, spiritual, whole life. So that's really at the heart of it. And I'll talk about that as we go along today from the role of the parent. This is my favorite quote when it comes to this spiritual idea of perfectionism. It's this really fundamental shift. And I use those words very intentionally. A fundamental shift. The quote is from Ram Dass. Ram Dass said, a lot of people try to counteract the I am not good enough with I am good enough. In other words, they take the opposite and they try to invest it. But that still keeps the world at the level of polarities. The art, the spiritual task, the psychological task, and I think of those as essentially synonymous. The psychological task is to go beyond the polarities. So the act, he says, is not to go to the world of I am good, to counteract I am bad, or I am lovable, as opposed to I am unlovable, but to go behind it to I am. I am. And I am includes the fact that I do crappy things and I do beautiful things, and I am. That includes everything, and I am. Just think about this for just a moment as a parent. I know I'm guilty of this, and I would suspect that virtually every viewer, every audience member, and every listener of the podcast can relate to it on some level. That when we struggle, when we have a setback, when we display a symptom or an issue, when we have a failure, when we have a challenge before us, that the parent that we are with, or if you're the parent, is so automatically inclined to try to fix it, to try to give advice, to try to give some kind of an instruction or guidance or support so that the person doesn't experience the failure. And the tragic paradox is it's embedded in that idea that I quoted from Freud early in the broadcast, that in order to grow, we have to experience failure. I think that that's the spiritual gift of parenting a child who's struggling with mental health issues. I wouldn't wish that on anybody. I can't wish that on anybody that I care about, let alone my enemies. If I have enemies, I don't really have enemies, but I don't wish that on anybody. But I can clearly say, as many parents who have written blogs for us have said, that having a struggling child has taught me more about life and myself than virtually anything else. That flopping and failing and recognizing my contribution, the thing that I care about and value most on planet Earth, is my family, my children specifically, and my wife. But talking about my children, that I care more about them than anybody and anything on Earth. And I fail at that as much as I fail at anything. At work, I don't fail that much. I know how to do my job. It's almost a break. That's why we can become so attracted to work. It can become compulsive and an addiction, because at work you get praise, you get mastery. A leads to B leads to C. 1 + 1 = 2. With children, it doesn't work that way. They are individual agents that aren't necessarily susceptible to the laws of cause and effect the way that we would think about them. They have choice. And to struggle or to fail at that, I think, is the beginning of a spiritual journey of discovering yourself, of learning this lesson that Ram Dass was talking about, at finding you. That's essentially what we teach, among other things. That's what gets presented over time by the experience. You have that experience that Ram Dass is talking about. You shift from trying to be good to just getting to be learning to be at peace with just who you are. That's that's what the opposite of anxiety or social anxiety would feel like, would look like. Making children believe that our feelings are about them is our greatest contribution to their anxiety. When we tell our children, as most of us do, as I've said many, many times, was my principal energy and idea in parenting when I came into it, was I'm going to tell my children articulately, using the skills that I've been taught with communication theory, how I feel. That will then be their indication to know when they're doing well or not. In other words, I will take my feelings and I will give them to them, communicate to them, and they will be responsible for my happiness or unhappiness, for my my fear or my peace of mind, for my sadness or my joy, for my anger and frustration or for my being pleased. So from birth, we wire the child to believe that what other people think about them is about them. And this is really critically important. And in early development as a Homo sapien, the child doesn't experience the parent as a separate entity. There is no other. There's just one. And the child interprets a parent's anger and frustration, disappointment and worry, which most parents would say, well, that's just an extension or an embodiment of my love. That's what most people will say. It's not. It's not that. Fear is fear, not love. Frustration and anger are not love. Worry is not love. And in many ways, those things, those energies are the opposite of love. So not only do we tell our children when we're upset and when we're sad and when we're happy, and that's supposed to be their responsibility to take care of, but then we communicate to them that it's love that we're doing. And just imagine how confused the child is when they grow up. And by the child, I mean us. I mean you, viewer, listener, and me. I go out in the world and in those situations, as I described by the diagnostic manual, where there's a chance of rejection and judgment, the stakes are phenomenally great. My very sense of worth and acceptance and belonging are hinging on whether or not people think I can hold down a social conversation or give a presentation at work or chit chat about the weather. That's the wiring. That's the programming. And so many of the podcasts that I listened to today that I mentioned earlier, they talked about this, but they talked about this idea of just stop thinking that way. Thought stopping. And if the powers, if the energy is relatively moderate or mild, thought stopping can work, replacing the idea with a mantra. Learning some kind of vocal stim. My daughter tells me that when she's feeling mild anxiety, that she hears that critical voice in her brain, she will say out loud, blah, 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 blah. When I was working on my book a few months ago, knowing that the voice of criticism would come into the writing room, I did a similar kind of thing where I would listen to it, tell me, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't have anything to add. You don't have anything to contribute. You have nothing new, nothing important, nothing valuable to offer anybody. I observed that voice and similar to my daughter's blah, 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 I just kind of chuckled at it, expected it, anticipated it, and just set it aside and went ahead and did the work anyway. So if the energy is somewhat moderate, those kinds of interventions can work. But as you all know, that doesn't work for a lot of us. That doesn't work for a lot of our children. No matter what kind of rational mindset you can offer the person suffering from significant anxiety, from an anxiety disorder, you can't break through the programming. And the programming is more than just verbal. It's unconscious, it's energy. The child grew up in a home, if the child grew up in a home like ours, like the one that I've created and the one that I grew up in, where there was palpable anxiety, the child constantly feels unsafe. And no amount of simple cognitive behavioral intervention is going to undo that kind of programming. It's deeper and more profound than just an idea or a communication skill. The growth mindset teaches us a lot about anxiety in our children. The growth mindset, I'll give you a very, very thin slice of it. But the growth mindset suggests that we praise children for their effort, not for their smartness, their intelligence, their giftedness. You praise children with giftedness, and a lot of parents do this in an effort to try to help the child feel good about themselves. We praise the child's intelligence or giftedness. But here's the thing. When children's abilities are praised, they get more anxious. They opt out of more challenging activities. They quit sooner. They cheat more. They lie more. When we praise their effort, something they can control, they choose more challenging activities. They're less likely to quit when they meet a roadblock because they're being praised for their anxiety. And along with being praised for anxiety, because you're not praising for results, for successful test completion or a successful task to be completed, the child's not afraid of that. But in our effort as parents to carpet the world, to protect our children from harm, which is just the expression of our unexplored anxiety disorders ourselves, we pass it on. And then we wonder, and then we go to therapists like me, like Evoke, like our wilderness program, like our intensive program. We go there looking for solutions. And the solution is in the problem. The solution is we have to rearrange as parents our orientation toward failure. But to do that, we have to heal ourselves because we think that failure is high stakes. So how do you do that? Well, the answer is this. You spend time talking to somebody who's regulated. You spend time talking with somebody who doesn't pass simple judgment, with an empathic, capable therapist or mentor or sponsor or support group. And you tell this crazy story about something really stupid that you did, some big mistake, some wrong thing that you did. And because the other person is regulated and understands what I'm talking about tonight and has done their own healing and has embodied that, they react as if it were nothing. And the child inside of you begins to understand it's okay. It's okay to be human. It's okay to make mistakes. In fact, it's essential. And then you take that healing and you go back to the child and you give to them what somebody gave to you. Part of what I hope these podcasts can do, I'm not interacting with you the way that a therapist would during these broadcasts, but part of what I hope it does for you, because I share so much of my own story, which includes so much of my own failures, is that you feel safe. You feel seen and understood. You feel that lack of fear for making a mistake or getting it wrong or denting your children or being an idiot spouse or parent or friend. You realize that it's okay. That's what I hope that you get out of this. More than the instruction, more than the specific skills and principles that I teach, I hope you get that feeling. That's the goal. And where does that come from? That comes from my own healing, right? That comes from sitting, not from my degree, not from my PhD, not from the books I read in graduate school or the professors that taught me, although one of them did some of this with me. Not from the books and the lessons and the courses that I've taken since. All of those things give me language, give me conceptual framework. But what gives me the ability to do some of this with you, even through a podcast, is my own therapy. That's what gives me the ability to be with you, to be with your horrible, rotten self. Because I've made some peace with my horrible, rotten self. So we learn to value mistakes, setbacks, and failures. Like the CEO of Spanx, the company that makes clothes, like she shared one time, they had a practice around the dinner table growing up that they were to share a failure every day, something they flopped at, something they failed at. And after each story, the father would give a toast. And if nobody had a failure or somebody didn't have a failure, the father would look discouraged playfully. And he was teaching them what it meant to be human. I almost named the book The Audacity to Be You. I almost named it Learning to Be a Human. Right? That would have been a perfect match with the Barbie movie at the end, when she made the decision to be a messy, imperfect, fallible, mortal human being instead of a plastic, perfect, everything's going to be okay, everything can be controlled, everything is contained object, thing, non-human. Are you rigging the game to win it? That's an idea that my oldest son, gave to me a few years ago when we were taking a walk, and I was talking about my stress level. He said, "Dad, you've got to figure out a way to set up the game that you win it. And the way that you're playing it right now, you can't win it. You can't be all that you want to be to all the people and all the places that you want to be those things. You have to drop balls. You have to let go. You have to fail. You have to flop. You have to give up. You have to quit. You have to let people down." Sometimes when I'm coaching parents early in my coaching process, I'll tell them, I'll teach them, you have to learn to drop balls. If you want to grow in your mental health and your spirituality, if you want to expand, if you want to have a greater impact and influence for other people, especially your children's mental health, you're going to have to get better at failing. You're going to have to accept your humanness, come to terms with it, which includes, like Ram Dass says, sometimes you do wonderful things and sometimes you absolutely drop the ball. And that's important. The distance between your ego being good and your authentic self can be described as anxiety. In childhood, we were taught a certain way to be. And we were taught if we were that way, that we would be assured of love, of proximity to a caregiver, and that caregiver then would be able to take care of us and keep us alive. So we became good kids. Or we were so overwhelmed and frustrated and stressed with the prospect of trying to be good, we rebelled. We got angry and we rebelled, or lied or cheated, because we knew at some level that the game was rigged against us. And then we grow up and we develop more capacity. Our ego gets larger. We're more capable of performing. We end up in relationships and marriages that we don't want, and we end up in situations and jobs and careers that we don't want. And we have to undo it all. We have to come to terms with our own humanity. We have to learn to fail intentionally, to quit, to give up, to let go, to give in. That is the spiritual journey. That is enlightenment. Enlightenment is not getting better. Enlightenment is becoming aware of just how flawed and human you are. And it's unlearning all of the ideas from the culture and from our parenting, from our childhood, that taught us the contrary, that the goal was to be good, to be plastic, to be beautiful and perfect and get it right. As if any of that was possible. Exploring your history and your family of origin is the key. This stuff is not rational. It can't be combated with rational talk. If it can, it doesn't rise to the level of diagnoses. And it can in some ways. But sometimes this is a lifelong issue we have to deal with. We're going to have to learn to cope with the fear that's in our body. And over a long period of time, it lessens as we face it. One of the most important lessons in therapy that I ever learned was that I was never not going to be scared or feel guilty when I was doing the right thing or practicing self-care. I was going to suffer through those feelings. They were going to be present. But through the experience of therapy, of sitting across from an empathic other, capable empathic therapist, I had new programming, new software in my brain that could combat and talk me through the fear and the guilt. Or you succumb to it. You give into it. That essentially is what the everything bagel in the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once symbolized, is giving into it. To that despair, to that annihilation, that darkness. I love what Bessel van der Kolk says. He said, trauma comes back as a reaction, not a memory. Some people say, well, I had a pretty good childhood, or I don't remember my childhood. You can start to see it by your reaction. If your child refuses to go to school, how do you react? If your partner criticizes you, how do you react? If somebody cuts you off in traffic, how do you react? If your mother or father calls you and asks what they would claim to be an innocuous question, how do you react? Trauma responses are the trail that we follow back home to discover what happened to us. Early in my years as a client, my therapist would say, after I was sharing something going on with me that week that I was challenged with or struggling with, and she would say to me, your mother and father weren't there for you. They couldn't see you. And she became more specific. And I would think at the time, this is just a thought that I have that I've since, of course, verbalized to her. But I would think, how does she know that? I'm not sure she's right, even. I think she's making a pretty big leap. And I haven't even told her enough about my parents, my mother and father, for her to arrive at that conclusion or to see that. But now I understand what she saw. She saw how I was built and put together. And that told me, because of her training, that told me about my childhood experience and my parents and my programming and the context that I grew up in. And that's what therapy can do for you. It can normalize it. It can help you look at yourself without the shame. It can help you give you new ideas, a new orientation toward failure, toward guilt, so that you can walk through things not feeling no fear and not feeling no guilt, but you can still walk through things feeling guilty and feeling scared. Remember this, and I can't say this with too much emphasis. Getting healthier will trigger feelings of guilt and fear. If it were not so, everybody would do it. I wouldn't have a job. There'd be a simple manual, everybody would read it, and that would be that. Some of the frequently asked questions I get asked around social anxiety or anxiety is, should I push my child harder? Should I let them stay home from school and find another avenue for education, like something online? Should I indulge their fears? Are they just lazy, or are they just seeking attention, or just trying to avoid something difficult? And of course, the answer is you. You get to decide. And like I say in the audacity to be you, you don't get the guarantee of being right. You just get the guarantee of being a human, the guarantee of being a self. But you don't get to win this battle and know all the right answers. And you still have to make decisions, and you get to decide. And you might make decisions and find later on that it's not going in the direction that you want. So then you change course. And you might have to do that over and over again. And if nothing else, if you can deal with that process of attempts and failures and resetting your course over and over again with a certain kind of calmness and acceptance, you're teaching your child the most important thing of all. You're teaching them that it's okay to fail, that it's okay to make mistakes, that it's okay to be accountable for a bad idea. And those lessons, those are the building blocks of mental health. But of course, we weren't taught that. We were taught that those are the things that ruin our mental health, the things that make us unlovable or unattractive or a failure. So which approach do you use? Do you use dialectical behavioral therapy? Like I talked about medication, cognitive behavioral therapy, action and commitment therapy, exposure therapy, right? Exposing yourself. I think there's always some exposure therapy in this, right? Taking successive steps toward the thing that scares you little by little, taking off bite-sized chunks. I think that's a part of it. But of course, at Evoke, we talk about it in terms of attachment. And most importantly, we espouse the principle taught by Dr. Stephen Mitchell that says the emphasis in psychotherapy, the emphasis is not on behaviors, but on rigorous thinking. Speaking of the therapist or the parent, not on constraints, but on self reflective emotional involvement, not on the application of general truths, but on imaginative participation. This approach suggests a very different sort of technique than what we've been taught. The discipline is not in the procedures, but in the sensibility through which the analyst, the therapist, the parent participates. It's how you are. It's how you think and how you feel that makes the difference. If you do it from a place of fear, which leads to control and shame and guilt, it's almost impossible to get it right. And if you do it from a place of love and courage and authenticity, it's almost impossible to get it wrong. Dr. Mitchell goes on to say there's no generic solution or technique. There's a great deal of disciplined thought and the skilled practice of psychoanalysis, clinical psychoanalysis, and continual complex choices. Now, that's for a psychoanalyst, but we borrow from that as parents and as therapists. And we look to attachment. I wrote this last year to explain attachment as simply as I can. We feel safe when we are around somebody safe, non-judgmental, accepting, flexible, creative, open, somebody that's embraced the dark parts of themselves, accepted the good and the bad of themselves. We feel safe when we're around somebody safe. Attachment theory explains that this sense of safety can be internalized and become essentially permanent. That's what attachment theory teaches us, is that the issues that we have today were in essence born in our childhood, derived from our childhood experiences, our earliest context, when we were most susceptible to shaping, to neurological conditioning. When caregivers consistently provide resonance, safety, and security, regardless of the tragedies over which they often have no control, the child develops an internal base of safety to carry throughout life. It is really important for you as a parent to learn to value seeing the child and not reducing the child to good and bad behaviors, problematic or healthy behaviors, but to see the child. And it's so counterintuitive, so paradoxical. But seeing the child is the cure. Not seeing the child was the poison in the first place. Objectifying the child, turning the child into a reflection of you and your parenting. Turning the child into something that you could manipulate and coerce and shape into being a good person. That's the cause. That's the poison. And the converse of it is just to see them. So that when your child comes to you and admits to a big mistake, I'm not going to get into tonight about whether or not you hold boundaries and have consequences when your child confesses something that they've done. You'll have to figure that out, or listen to another one of my broadcasts where I talk about behavioral theory. But in essence, when the child comes to you and confesses a dilemma, a mistake, a moral failing of their part, if you respond with fear and dread, the child has the experience that you're not safe, that they're not safe, that they're not okay. But if you can learn to regulate your nervous system because you've done your own work, that you can be calm in your response and curious, the child learns that they're okay and they get better over time. They get better by just being seen. That's what attachment theory teaches us. The result of a secure attachment, or in adulthood, it's often referred to as earned attachment. The result of a secure attachment is the sense that one is home, that we are the home that we seek. It's safety, it's security, it's the feeling, the sense, the known and felt sense in your body. I'm okay. And poets refer to it, prophets who teach about religion refer to this feeling, this sense of home inside your body as heaven. Not, the idea wasn't that it was some external place that you go to. It is available to us now. If we do the work to find it, do the work of healing. Talking about attachment theory, there are three or four, depending upon how you think about it, types of styles of attachment. The first one is secure. That's the one that we know is the greatest contribution to a child's well-being, to a person's well-being. As the name may imply, this style of attachment is based on the ability to form long-lasting, secure, and healthy relationships. It's the result of feeling safe and secure with your caregivers as a child, as well as validated, understood, and comforted. In other words, the child goes to the parent when they are stressed or afraid, and the parent is calm. The parent doesn't get anxious and try to fix it, Try to cover it up and try to make the child not feel sad or scared. The child welcomes it. The parent takes in the fear and distress, metabolizes it because of their greater capacity, and feeds back to the child that sense that the child is okay, that everything's okay. Some signs that you have a secure attachment style can include your ability to regulate your emotions, being comfortable alone and in relationships, and being able to communicate effectively. Avoidance styles. Avoidance styles of attachment. This attachment style is defined as the inability to form. This is, by the way, this is my attachment style. My attachment style from childhood. My default under stress. Avoidant attachment style is defined as the inability to form or maintain long-lasting relationships due to not being able to engage in physical or emotional intimacy. The fear of creating long-term relationships generally stems from childhood and having strict or absent caregivers. In my case, it was absent. These caregivers may have left you to fend for yourself or didn't respond when you expressed needs or emotions. Some sides include having a hard time trusting people, uncomfortable expressing your feelings, or a fear of commitment. Those who have avoidant attachment style may tend to keep others at arm's length and avoid getting into relationships, whether romantic or otherwise. Right? It's that sense that there's no place to go for comfort, that you're on your own. So you can't express your need. You can't be vulnerable. It's more common in a lot of cases with the men that I've worked with in my career who have been taught, it's more than taught, conditioned, trained to believe that to need was to be weak. And what happens, like happened for me in childhood, is when I grew up with a single mother who was overwhelmed with life. And because of that, she was unavailable to me. And so my distress when I shared it with her, and I was a highly sensitive person, right? That came with me from birth. I was sensitive more than my brothers. I came to her with my needs and my sensitivities and my big feelings. And because she was overwhelmed, the way that she dealt with them was to make me feel like something was wrong with me, that I was too needy. The word that she specifically used in my childhood was, "You're being melodramatic." And that was the cue for shame for me. So I learned not to feel. I learned not to ask. I learned to cope by myself. I found things like substances and food and sex and work and anything else to give me a sense of okayness because I couldn't get it from the connection that was supposed to provide it for me. The next version is anxious attachment. This type of attachment style is another type of insecure attachment. It's also known as anxious ambivalent. It is characterized by the fear of rejection, the fear of abandonment, depending upon others, such as your partner, for validation. This attachment style generally stems from inconsistent parenting or caregiving, where the child has difficulty understanding the caregiver and there may be a lack of security. That is so common with our clients in our program to have this anxious attachment, right? The child is inclined to go toward, let's say, the mother. And sometimes the mother can provide support and nurturing, a nurturing, connected, attuned response. And sometimes the mother gets overwhelmed or the father gets overwhelmed, shames the child or punishes the child or yells at the child or tries to make the child not feel what they're feeling. So the child has this no safe harbor, no place to go, no ability to self-soothe. Some signs that point to having anxious attachment style include being highly sensitive to criticism, having jealous tendencies and low self-esteem, difficulty trusting others and feeling unworthy of love. This can manifest itself in the form of needing constant reassurance and blaming yourself for possible challenges in the relationship. The final style is disorganized. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because this is inconsistent. It's kind of a bit of both. Oftentimes, it's caused by significant trauma or neglect. It's less common than the others. The key to all of this with your children is co-regulation. Learning to regulate your nervous system, taking the responsibility. In Al-Anon, when they say, and I quote them saying, "Your serenity is your responsibility," that's what I'm saying. That's a self-help way of saying It's your responsibility to regulate your nervous system. And if you have a child that's struggling with anxiety, depression, self-harm, school refusal, substance abuse, you name it, you need extra support and help with this. Because anybody's going to be triggered by some of those things. And the dance between or with your child is ages. It's ancient. It's since the first interactions. It's probably pre-birth, probably in utero. Co-regulation is the key. We can pass down our trauma to our children. We call that the intergenerational transmission of trauma. And we can pass down our healing or our regulation to children. We learn to de-shame our children for their mistakes, for their anxiety. I want to de-shame you during this. I'm not going to de-shame you by telling you you're all great and none of this is your issue. That's the old way. I'm going to tell you, you have something in this. You're part of the dance. You're part of the problem. But the good news about being part of the problem is that means you're also a part of the solution. If you're not a part of the problem, you got to find something somewhere else to fix it. It's got to be outside of you. And most likely that's going to look like trying to fix your kid. Right? The idea for the anxiously attached person is if I can fix my kid, I will feel okay. I will sleep at night. My nervous system will be regulated. But that doesn't work. That causes it to snowball. I read a quote that I love from a famous psychologist that says that the ability to be alone and at peace is the same ability, the same characteristic, the same attribute as the ability to be in a healthy, intimate relationship. The foundation is you and your nervous system. And if you're like me, and you are to some degree, more or less, that means you need therapy, you need support groups, you need help. This is normal stuff. This is part of the human experience. And I believe it's exacerbated because of our exposure to the world's traumas these days, to what's going on. We have to understand that we are the product of our contexts. That's really clear about Homo sapiens. Our context shapes us. Our context programs us. It's not the things that we say. The critical voice, the scary voice inside of your head, you weren't born with it. You might have been born with a nervous system that was particularly sensitive to those messages, but you weren't born with those negative messages. Those were inherited from your context. And I'm not doing this to pick on parents because it happened to them first and it happened to their parents before them and their grandparents before them. It is just the truth. We have to own it. And the key to it is self-compassion. And how do we develop more self-compassion? You develop it by spending time around somebody who's compassionate toward you. I love what Thich Nhat Hanh said. This is a quote from one of his books. I believe it's called You Are Here. He says, "Dear one, I am here for you. You should talk to your depression or your anger just as you would to a child. You embrace it tenderly with the energy of mindfulness and say, 'Dear one, I know you are there and I am going to take care of you just as you would with your crying baby.' There's no discrimination or dualism here because compassion and love are you, but anger is too. All three are organic in nature, so you don't need to be afraid. You can transform them." We learn to look at our symptoms, our bad behavior, the things that we were told to be terrified of and afraid of, the things that we were told to not look at, the things that we were told not to have compassion for. And we learn compassion by sitting with somebody who's compassionate towards us. In other words, we are healed in the same way that we were wounded in relationship with another person. And the therapist or the therapeutic group or mentor or sponsor becomes the parenthood you never had. And therapy and meetings become the childhood that you never had. Harriet Lerner wrote a great book about anxiety and fear called The Dance of Fear. She said, "But when anxiety operates as a chronic underground force, we may fail to identify it as the culprit behind our poor functioning. We just feel bad about ourselves, which of course revs up our anxiety even more. We think that the problem is that we have a child that's struggling with mental health or that there's a war going on right now, or that there are injustices happening. We think that that is the cause of our anxiety. Yes, those are triggers. Yes, those are environmental factors, but the place of intervention is our nervous system. And because as human beings, we have this thing that we refer to as negative bias, this evolutionary trait where we see threats much more clearly and profoundly than we see positive things. Imagine yourself as a primitive human being walking along a trail. If you miss a saber-toothed tiger, you're dead. And you don't live to pass on your genes. So you have to see the threat. Your brain is wired to prioritize the threat. If you miss a piece of low-hanging fruit, in other words, a positive thing, you miss a meal. So our brains are wired to register, to notice, to take hold of threat. That's why somebody can say 10 positive things and one negative, and we will only remember the negative. That's the negative bias. That's the thing that got us to this point where we could survive. But because most of us aren't living day to day, facing saber-toothed tigers, literal or real, literal or figurative, we have to work on this stuff. We have to do deeper spiritual work. The trigger, your anger, your disappointment, your fear, your terror, your inability to sleep because of your child's struggle, your inability to stay present when your spouse is dysregulated. The trigger is not in the way. The trigger is the way. As Rumi said, the solution for the pain is in the pain. We go into it. We look at it. We explore it. We deal with it. We don't do what is essentially the core feature of anxiety disorders. We don't avoid it. We face the dragon. That's the symbol that Joseph Campbell uses or Nietzsche used. We face the dragon. We deal with it. And we don't do it alone. You don't have to do this alone. You can do this with an Evoke coach, with a therapist at home, with an intensive program. And as we face our dragons, we learn to do things scared. Harriet Lerner said, the more you try to make fear go away, an impossible dream, rather than learning to function with it, the worse you will feel about yourself. You will let fear stop you from doing what you need to do. You will mistakenly see yourself as weak and impaired, as an impaired individual, rather than a strong, competent person who happens to have an overactive fear response. And I wrote, no matter the difficulty, it is imperative that we develop a practice and a position of self-love. And the way that you develop a position of self-love is to sit across from somebody who loves you even when you absolutely fail, even when you do the horrible of horrible things. They respond to you differently than your parents do. Your parents, unfortunately, have safety and security at the forefront. It kept you alive as a child, of course. But when the world gets bigger and you become a teenager, that instinct needs to be reined in. And sometimes it's a therapist or somebody outside of the family system that can best serve to mirror back that sense of safety. Failure to practice this position of self-love, to develop it by doing your work, will lead to more and more suffering. You have to have a practice. Therapy, meditation, support groups, exercise. Not solutions that become a part of the problem, not trying to convince yourself of something that's not true because it makes you feel better, but dealing with it, dealing with the pain, going into the trauma, looking right at your trauma response and following it. Learning to take timeouts and be responsible for your own nervous system regulation. Sitting with yourself. I recommend The Dance of Fear by Harriet Lerner as a great book. Boundaries are critical to managing anxiety. We must face our shadow side, our guilt and our shame, and embrace what is within our control to create a world that it feels safer to us. If getting healthier was easy and painless, everybody would do it. You're going to have to do things that cause you to feel guilty. It's an unavoidable fact of life. Attunement for your child, for you in psychotherapy, is the silver bullet when it comes to parenting in parenting a child with anxiety. First, you have to know yourself, unravel your own trauma. This is so you get clear that you're responding to them, to your children and their trauma, and not to yours. You sort out your stuff so you can be there for them. So the take home, if you need medication, I advise you to consult with a medical doctor to find out about what's available, what the side effects are. Those can often get you into the starting gate so that sleep, diet, exercise, therapy, all the other things that we know help can be more accessible to you. Developing a practice of self-compassion, grappling with guilt, spending time with somebody who doesn't have advice, who doesn't have answers, who isn't interested in you being good and getting it right, who's more interested in you being a person, a human. Finding resources in your community, support groups. If money's an issue, Al-Anon and Codependence Anonymous are great options. Learning to own your limitations, so take responsibility for your own happiness. Develop self-care practices, which are eventually, inevitably going to cause you to feel guilt. Self-care really comes down to guilt for me. Because self-care means at the moment, the important moment, decisive moment, you're choosing yourself and your nervous system over being there for somebody else. And because of what we've been taught about parenting, about being a mother or being a father or a spouse or a friend, we don't let ourselves do that. But as my friend said to me years ago, when I was confessing my profound struggle in this area, and I still struggle with it today, but this one particular moment, he said, the world needs a version of Brad that takes care of himself, even if in the moment other people get let down. We need that. My children need that. Avoiding the I can handle anything mistake. That's that avoidant attachment style of mine. That's the mistake that I make. Take on less, including the suffering of others. Part of the shift that happens in healthy parenting is you realize that your child's life is not yours, that they're not yours. They are their own. If you believe in God, you can think of them as their gods. If you're not particularly religious, you can think of them, they're just the universes or their own. And that's hard to say because that very idea brings such a conflict for so many people about guilt and shame and cognitive dissonance and it just doesn't make sense. It feels like not love. We were taught that a parent is only supposed to be as happy as their least happy child. We were taught that as a virtue. And yet that's the cause of the suffering. That's the cause of the suffering. Go to therapy, go to support groups. Go to support groups where other family members of individuals suffering from mental health and addiction issues go to and listen. Listen to how they found peace and how that peace has not only contributed to them having a better life, but they become more impactful and influential on the very person that they were trying to help. Not by focusing on fixing them, but by focusing on fixing themselves. The shift is to stop making your child the project and make you the project. This is inevitable. This is the truth. There's no real good argument against it. Cultural conditioning and messaging be damned. Learn that your happiness, your serenity is your responsibility, and that you have to take a spiritual vacation. Sometimes during the day, many times. All right, folks, I hope that was helpful. My two books that speak about attachment theory and all this, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon and Audible. We have support groups. These are the places you can go to talk about your grief, your pain, your sadness with other people that can listen and hold space for you. November 16th is the next offering for current and alumni wilderness families. Once a month, we have an alumni only wilderness family alumni only meeting. November 21st at 6:30 p.m. is that next offering. And then once a month, we have an intensive offering. December 12th at 6 p.m. is the next offering. Contact support groups at evoketherapy.com or go to our website for more information. We have family treks available for individuals who want to spend several days in the wilderness having a therapeutic experience with their child or as a couple. You can do that in connection with your wilderness program at the end, in the middle, in between, maybe before going home, or even if you don't have a wilderness experience, you can do a therapeutic trek, a family trek. Contact admissions@evoketherapy.com for more information. We have coaches who can help with all of this work, everything that I've talked about tonight. Can help parents, couples, family issues, or just individual issues. Contact coaching@evoketherapy.com. We encourage all families to try at least 6 of any combination of the following meetings: alanon.org, coda.org, familiesanonymous.org, or adultchildren.org. You can also go to refugerecovery.org or nami.org to find free classes and resources in your local communities. All these broadcasts are available on your favorite podcast app or Spotify. Just go there and search Finding You an Evoke Therapy podcast. Please listen, follow, share, and give us a review. You can also go to soundcloud.com on your computer and listen to Finding You there, or you can go to Evoke's YouTube channel and watch the rebroadcast of the video versions of these. You can find Evoke Therapy programs and me, Dr. Brad Reedy, on X, Threads, and Instagram using the handles @EvokeTherapy or @Dr. Brad Reedy, respectively. You can find Evoke Therapy Intensives on Instagram using the handle @EvokeTherapy Intensives. And on Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And of course, our blog has wonderful content each week. If you want to give back or you need assistance, the 3 charitable partners that we work with are choosementalhealth.org, sky'sthelimitfund.org, or evokefamilyfoundation.org are coming to the end of the year, so your tax-deductible donations can be earmarked for a specific program or even a specific population issue, if that so be your desire. All right, folks, my next broadcast will be in 48 hours. I'm going to have a live Q&A. Any questions left over from tonight, you can always email questions, suggestions, anything you'd like to webinar@evoketherapy.com. I'll take any of the pre-submitted questions first and then any live questions that come up. That's Thursday night, November 16th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Siblings, family, and friends of Evoke. Look forward to that. All right, folks, I hope this was a helpful point of contact. And as always, for and on behalf of the people that you love and that love you, thank you for showing up and being willing to do your work. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you Thursday night. Take care. Bye-bye.